We have come to the end of the season of Epiphany. And if you recall back to the beginning, that first Sunday after the Epiphany, we heard the story of the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan. And the voice that was heard there is the exact same words we hear in this passage today. So these two stories make a wonderful bookend to the season. So Jesus baptized in the Jordan, the Holy Spirit descends, he comes up out of the water, and they hear a voice, "This is my son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And today we find ourselves on the mountain of the Transfiguration. Jesus is changed and looks dazzlingly white, and there's a cloud full of light, and a voice says, "This is my son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Really creates a beautiful bookend to this season where we have looked at Jesus showing forth his glory in particular ways, in his baptism, in his teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, in a couple of healing stories. We were told that he healed the crowds who came to him. In other seasons of Epiphany, we hear a couple of other stories. Most traditionally in this season, we hear the story of the changing of water into wine in Cana of Galilee, which we did not hear this year, but we did sing about it in our opening hymn, because it is a very keen Epiphany story where we see Jesus manifesting his power, showing who he is. Now, hold all that in mind, and I'm going to come back to it, but I want to tell you a story about this past summer. I had the opportunity to be in Cape Town, South Africa, and Chris and my niece Noelle and I all climbed up Table Mountain. There's a cable car that you can take up, which makes it much faster and much easier, but we decided to do things the hard way, which is pretty common for me. We hiked up, and as we're going up the trail, it's beautiful, there's flowers, it was a lovely day, the sun was shining. The higher up we got, the cloudier and cloudier it got, the colder it got, until we climbed up into this cloud, which sits on the top of Table Mountain. They call it the tablecloth, because this cloud sits on top of the flat mountain. And the light that was coming would refract off of all of the fog that was there, all this cloud, and it was this dazzling cloud. And occasionally the cloud would part, and we could look down and see the ocean, we could see the city of Cape Town, we could look out across and see quite a distance in the beautiful land of South Africa where we were. I can imagine the disciples who are with Jesus. Jesus takes his little crew, his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, up the mountain today. I don't know what they thought initially. Maybe Jesus likes to hike. There's a good mountain here. Let's go for a walk. And they climb the mountain, and they find themselves in this transcendent place. And in the first lesson, we heard the story of Moses on the mountain receiving the law at Sinai, right, with the cloud and the fire. Mountains are a place where things happen religiously and spiritually in ancient Israel. Mountains are moments when people have these transcendent experiences. They have that farther vision, a little closer to heaven maybe. Special things happen on mountaintops. And that's what happened to Moses. This is what happens to Jesus and his disciples. And we get another interesting little parallel between the two passages. We're told Moses was on the mountain 6 days. And in our passage from the gospel, it's 6 days after Jesus is said to be the Christ by Peter, right? Peter makes his great confession, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." 6 days later, they go up the mountain for the fullness, a more full revelation. And of course, 6 days harkens us back to the story of creation itself, right? God creates everything in 6 days, and then on the seventh day is the Sabbath day, this special day that God sets apart. And so all of these Old Testament echoes start coming through in this story. And of course, who appears with Jesus but Moses, who is the great giver of the law on Mount Sinai, and Elijah, the great prophet, who himself has his own mountaintop experiences, right? You may remember the story of Elijah on the mountain where a wind passes, a fire passes, an earthquake passes, and none of those are God. And then he hears the sound of sheer silence, or the King James Version says a still small voice, and God is there in that sound of sheer silence, or that still small voice. And Elijah also, when he has to flee from King Ahab and his wife because of something that he did, he hides on a mountaintop, and God sends ravens to bring him bread and nourish him in that time period. It's one of my favorite stories. So up on top of this mountain, we have Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, and we're told, of these three, listen to my son. Jesus is in company with the great giver of the law, with the wondrous prophet of old. And God points us right to him. Listen to him. And one of my favorite pieces of devotional literature that I like to read, usually a couple times a year, is The Pilgrim's Progress. It was a great Puritan piece of literature. Some say it was even the first novel, right? It's an allegory about the journey of Christian from the city of destruction to the heavenly city. It's a wonderful thing. In early America, oftentimes, if a house had one book, they'd have a Bible. If they had two books, they'd have a Bible and a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, right? It was that important in early American literature, even though it was written in England. But as Christian is going from the city of destruction and he's on his journey, he gets to this place called the Palace Beautiful, where they take him up to a high place in the palace. And there he gets some clarity of vision, and he's able to look across the journey that's in front of him. And he sees all the way across the distance the mountains, the delectable mountains, which are within sight of the heavenly city. Because he has this moment of clarity up in a high place. And then he comes down from there and has to enter into the valley of humiliation and into the valley of the shadow of death, where it's easy to forget the things that we see when we're on a high mountain, right? And our lectionary places the story of the Transfiguration as the last thing we hear before we enter into the season of Lent, right? It gives us a glimpse of what the resurrection life is like, of the glory of Jesus shining out. A reminder to us of who God is and who Jesus is and what he does before we go down into the valley. Right? We're going to go into the Valley of Lent on Wednesday with Ash Wednesday, where we make an intentional mark of our mortality by putting ashes on our forehead and repenting of the things that we have done and left undone in one of the most potent ways we do ever, with our litany of penitence on Ash Wednesday. But before we are sent into the valley, we are given a vision on the mountain. A vision of Jesus transfigured, of a cloud that shines with radiance. We have to hold on to that memory as we enter into these quieter, darker, more dangerous places in our spiritual journey. The mountain of the Transfiguration, this last epiphany, is what Jesus offers to this inner circle before he sets his face to Jerusalem. And we'll start hearing those stories. So what's the takeaway for us from this story? First of all, I think that always looking for an application of every Bible story can be not always the most fruitful thing. I do think that Bible stories are full of applications for our life, but some stories are meant just to be looked at, to be gazed at, to have the wonder of the moment, right? And if you do a Google image search of Transfiguration, you will see the ways in which this story has inspired art for centuries and centuries and centuries. This moment is a moment that allows us to gaze in wonder at God doing something that we don't fully understand, right? The disciples, when they saw this, they fell down terrified, and Jesus had to touch them and tell them not to be afraid. We ourselves can gaze at this moment and take it in as a wondrous thing without knowing exactly what it means, right? We don't have to know exactly what it means. But I do think that there are things that we can gain from this. One is go hiking more often, right? There's not a whole lot of high places that you can climb to in Florida, but there are a few spots where you can go up and get that long view and get that clear sight across the land. And it gives us some insight about where we are, because we can't always see where we are when we're down in it. We have to have some perspective. One place I like to do this is Robinson Preserve in Bradenton. They have a great observation tower there. And also right up here at Weeden Island, there's an observation tower you can climb up. And you can look across Tampa Bay and St. Petersburg and see clearly for miles in both directions. And you get a sense of where you are. Here we are on the mountain of the Transfiguration. We get a sense of where we are. Jesus is illuminated with the glory of his Father. This is the eternal truth. We're going to enter into the season of Lent, which is a preparation for Easter. But Epiphany today, in this Transfiguration story, is a reminder that our reality, in truth, regardless of what season or time of year it is, whether we're in Lent or Christmas or wherever, we are always in Easter. Easter is the perpetual season for us. The resurrection will never be undone, and we live in that. The apostles got to see a little glimpse of that before they enter into the road to Calvary. And it's something that can encourage us in our own walks, because sometimes the road is really hard. Sometimes we enter into a valley of humiliation. Sometimes we're in the valley of the shadow of death, and we cannot see what we once were able to see. And our journey can become very troubled. So we hold on to the Transfiguration moments where we had that faith, where we saw that vision of God, trusting that that clarity is true and that it's something that we can grasp onto as we struggle our way through to the next way station. Christian in the Pilgrim's Progress went from the Palace Beautiful through those valleys until he came to the Delectable Mountains, where he was given another sight of the heavenly city that he had to go to. Wherever you are in your journey, if you're in a valley place, remember the times when you were refreshed, when God did give you a sense of his presence in your life. You saw the transfigured power of God. Hold on to that, because the next way station is coming. We're going to enter the Lenten journey as we head to Easter. But every day, it's always Easter. And that transfigured light of Christ with that command, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him," stands true, whether you can see it or not. Amen.
Amen.